It's the day I really look forward to because it brings this guy who's so generous with his time. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner. His investigative work has been recognized with Pulitzers and all the other accolades that the journalism community bestows upon people. And his books are bestsellers. He's written books about Trump. He's written books about the tax code and how it's exploited by the wealthiest Americans. And his perspective on government, on law, on international politics, it's just one that we can't get enough of. Welcome for David Cay Johnston, everybody.
Hello, Mark.
Hello, sir. Just because it was mentioned and because he is in the news right now, and I sort of have revised my take now after looking back at his administration a bit. Could you give me a thought about Jimmy Carter and his presidency? And he inherited a bad economic situation from Ford. The Iranian crisis with hostages occurred during his administration. I wonder if you can give me, he had solar panels on the White House. He was a kind of he may be one of the smartest guys to ever sit in that office, right, David?
Yes. Well, remember that we were coming out of the era of Nixon, and up to that time, the most serious threat to our democracy posed by the criminal activities of Nixon, who, was pardoned by Jerry Ford and whose tax lawyer went to prison. Yes, Carter was hit with a lot of things that were unfortunate, but that's the nature of the presidency. Obama came into office having inherited this terrible economy. Right after George W. Bush came into office, we had 9/11, and that's the nature of the job. You're supposed to live with those things. Mm-hmm. I've always thought it's significant that in the Navy, Carter was a nuclear submarine officer. He wasn't a commander, but he was an officer in a nuclear submarine. And one of the criticisms of him at the time was that he treated everything as equally important. Well, if you're an officer in a nuclear submarine, that might be a very important mindset to have, because you don't want anything to go wrong. But he didn't do a good job of prioritizing. And a lot of people were turned off by his efforts to separate himself from the imperial presidency. He came off Air Force One carrying his own suit bag on occasion. He ordered the thermostats turned down in the White House and wore sweaters. And this simply didn't sit well with the American people, or at least a large segment of them. And as Kim was pointing out, there's never been a more decent human being in the White House than Jimmy Carter. Nobody, and I don't think anybody at all in his league. And we've had, rogues and idiots and scholars and thoughtful people, but nobody with the depth of character and who is, by every definition, actually a Christian than Jimmy Carter.
Right. And when you say actually a Christian, it's not so much the belief in the Lord or going to church. It's that sort of living the life right. That's that's professed to be the life.
As opposed to our most recent former president, who goes around calling himself a Christian and yet wrote 6 pages in one of his books calling Christians fools, idiots, schmucks, and denouncing them and declaring that his life philosophy is one word: revenge, which is as aggressively anti-Christian as you can possibly get. And I'm not arguing that
he strong-armed a whole crowd just to take a photo up with a Bible upside down or whatever. Right. He was virtue signaling or whatever.
The point is that Carter was who he said he was, right, more than I think anybody else that we've seen in office. And he was a model of how to live a moral life.
But it's almost like he was too nice, too good to play dirty politics. And in order to get things done in Washington, D.C., you got to play the dirty politics. I don't like it, but that's the way it is. And so reality, I wonder if that's why he wasn't successful, because he was kind of too far above the, knowing where the bodies are buried and the grime and the backstabbing horribleness.
Well, look at Joe Biden, and you can see something very important. Joe Biden is the first president since Lyndon Johnson with a very deep knowledge of how Washington works. Carter was an outsider. He was governor of Georgia. Mm-hmm. Ronald Reagan was an outsider. He'd been governor of California and made a lot out of how much he stayed away from Washington. Now, George H.W. Bush was an insider, but he had run the CIA, and his field was foreign policy, not domestic. Bill Clinton, governor of Arkansas, a small and poor state. And George W. Bush, the most incurious man who's ever been in the White House, at least in my lifetime. And then Barack Obama, also an outsider. He was a U.S. senator basically long enough to have a cup of coffee in the Capitol. And along comes Biden with this incredibly deep knowledge of how things work. And although the public doesn't seem to grasp it and the news media coverage has been hostile, he's enormous accomplishments. And he just did something that I think was enormously brave. He's the first president in my lifetime, and perhaps much longer, who went outside of a secure military zone when he went to Kyiv. You know, when a couple of presidents went to Iraq and Afghanistan, they were deeply inside thoroughly secured areas. Biden was not. And 30 years ago, in 1993, Biden had a 3-hour, at the time, secret meeting with Slobodan Milosevic, where he told him to his face, "You're a war criminal and you should be tried and imprisoned." And of course, Milosevic later, after the war in Bosnia, Croatia, and Herzegovina, became the only head of state in modern times who's actually been arrested and tried. His trial went on for 5 years with the delays, and he died in prison before there was a verdict. But I think it's without a doubt that he was a war criminal. They could have killed Biden. He was just a senator. And you have this murderous, genocidal group of people that Milosevic is leading, and he went and met with him one-on-one. So I think that people should pay a lot of attention. Marjorie Taylor Greene, of course, thinks that this is an atrocity, that on President's Day, the president was in Kyiv and not paying attention to us. And of course, she wants Russia to win because at core, if she has a philosophy, it's fascistic and autocratic.
Yeah, well, she also is coming up with this, look, that's its own kind of signaling, right, to a constituency that, you know, just wants fireballs thrown all the time. I was going to say she came up with this wanting to secede. She believes that the red and blue cannot work. It was just yesterday, I believe, that she well, look, when you get to how the country is constructed, I believe you can summarize this, David, but essentially the blue states are throwing in a lot more than the red states into the collective kitty that supports in terms of federal funds and state-funded federal coffers.
Yeah, it's one of the curious things about America that the welfare states tend to be Republican. Alaska has its, in the words of someone like, or the view of someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene, its socialist policy of distributing oil money to the citizenry, and it's quite red. And this is one of the oddities. My father, who grew up in New Orleans and left in 1929, just as he was turning 19, because he just couldn't stand the racism and went west, he used to always say that the Yankees made a big mistake at the end of the war. They should have hung the traitors and let the states go away. I never bought that argument.
Who said that? Your father?
My father was livid about racism.
Right.
And his whole life. He was a 100% disabled veteran of World War II and a chef, and slowly dying for the 20 years that I knew him until actually was yesterday. He died 54 years ago yesterday.
Oh, wow.
But he felt very strongly that the South was not going to come to grips with its legacy of racism. And you can find people on the internet who are in favor of let's bring back slavery, let's expel these people who don't have white skin from the country. I mean, they're all over the place. And Donald Trump has given them permission by, calling neo-Nazis fine people and other remarks. And it's, we have tensions, but there's no need to take the Republic apart over it. And Marjorie Taylor Greene, remember, probably speaks to a very small circle of people, and the depth of her knowledge is roughly the equivalent of the sheet on your bed at night.
She's not the deepest person. I agree with that. So she plays one tune, and she's playing it all the time, 24/7. Let me ask you about this move that Biden made. As you suggested, it's quite courageous. His history in going to these various areas and calling out, as you've also suggested, the war criminals in the case of Milosevic, is a good one, is one to be proud of. Let me ask you about what's going on at the same time in this country. Palestine, Ohio, of course, East Palestine is being affected by this ongoing horror with the chemical explosion, chemical leak, a poisoning of waterways and land and soil. I say this because they can say what they want about how everything's safe now. I mean, fish, wildlife, dead, sick. People are going into doctors' offices with all the symptoms associated with kind of the poisonings that would parallel this sort of thing. Shouldn't the Biden administration have sent the president there early on in this process? I mean, because now there's a visual now with Trump going to this area. And of course, Trump only cares about the photo op. Biden actually has the heart. That's where the point I was making in the first hour. Why didn't he go early on to this situation? Wasn't that a mistake?
When presidents go to these disaster scenes, they shouldn't go early on because it diverts all sorts of resources away from the work that needs to be done. And we got to get over this notion that somehow it helps for the president to come right away, because it doesn't. It's negative. But in either the second or third book in my Trump trilogy, so either It's Worse Than You Think or The Big Cheat, there's a whole chapter called Bomb Trains. And it's about Elaine Chao, a.k.a. Mrs. Mitch McConnell, who was transportation secretary, and how the railroads and the shale oil industry, particularly for Bakken crude from North Dakota, wanted to loosen the rules on safety. And they did so. So trains are still using the Westinghouse air brake technology developed in the late 19th century. We're in the 21st century, instead of modern braking. And Norfolk Southern, which owns the train that's involved in the East Palestine problem, and in the recent, since then, Michigan derailment, fought this tooth and nail to not spend the money and delay it. And when I have said on your show before, we need to rethink white collar crime, I think we need to have some kind of accountability for this action. There were plenty of people who said, if you don't adopt these new modern braking policies, especially as we get trains that are 100 cars and longer, we're going to have death and destruction. And if you're spending your shareholders' money to argue against that, there ought to be some kind of serious penalty for you for these things, where we know there's danger if something happens. And I don't know exactly how to think this through, trust me, but I do think that our legal scholars should be working very hard on revising our thoughts about white collar crime and white collar culpability and accountability.
Oh, this is such a great point. And of course, you saw it with the mortgage crisis in 2008 in a totally different way. It didn't involve poisons, but it involved an economic toxicity. So the idea somehow that these guys skate without owning any of it, it's reprehensible. It's awful. It's, if I can say it, un-American.
Well, what I call these rules that shift the costs off onto us as taxpayers. For example, if there's all Amtrak trains run on lines owned by the freight railroads. If there's a crash and there are damages, they're paid by the taxpayers. Even if, as in the case I wrote about years ago in Free Lunch, you can prove that the railroad, CSX in this case, was the proximate cause of a fatal crash that killed a lot of train riders. The company defends the case, but when it's all over, it then just hands the bill to the taxpayers because Congress passed a law. Well, when you tell railroads, well, you don't have to pay the bills for people killed in an Amtrak crash, even if you caused it, that's a vicious policy, not a virtuous one. It encourages you to behave viciously by not maintaining safety, where on the other hand, a virtuous policy would reward and encourage the right kind of conduct. And these problems have gone on for a long, long time. Now, there's a whole bunch of things Biden inherited that he didn't jump on. Trump's IRS commissioner, who was a specialist in helping tax cheats get off the hook, he was there until I think last October. Trump hasn't gotten rid of the postmaster general, which he can't do directly, but he can indirectly by appointing people. He's really been slow on a whole bunch of terrible appointees and policies. The one thing where it's a good thing he's left somebody in place is he got resignations from 89 of the 90 U.S. attorneys, but the one in Delaware who's investigating his son, Hunter Biden, was left in place and has been free to pursue Hunter Biden, his son, which he should do. And I'm glad that he did the right thing. I can't imagine if it were Donald Trump that would happen for a minute.
No, I mean, that'd be the first guy out if it were Trump. But
as in fact happened in New York with Preet Bharara.
Right. Thank you. Exactly right. You're so right about this, and it's interesting that the Republican general position is, and I hate to always make it party specific, but it is sort of the familiar refrain: government's bad. Government. We need smaller government. You even hear Kinzinger talking about that. I was seeing an interview with Kinzinger talking about, do you still consider yourself a Republican? He says, well, I don't know what the Republican Party stands for anymore, but I'm still for smaller government. So smaller government, again, they reflexively talk about that. Yet they've grown government, the Republicans have. Bush grew what? He grew Homeland Security, TSA. It all created the biggest government agency in history of our government was grown under Bush. So much for small government. But the point is, here in the case of Palestine, now you see the GOP and Trump himself calling for where is FEMA? Where is the government? Hey, guys, you're the ones who deregulated. You, Trump, deregulated that braking thing. You rolled back those protections against these toxic chemicals being transported without warning. And now you want the government involved? You can't have it both ways.
Yeah, but that's exactly what they want to do. I mean, back in the early 1950s, when I was a little kid, the Republican Party said publicly, we're going to protect Social Security. We didn't have Medicare back then, but Social Security, and we're going to expand it. And they talked about how they were the friend of working people and unions. And during the Reagan era, Republicans described themselves as the party of ideas. The problem is it's no longer a party of ideas. It is a party who at its top has a absolutely craven, empty suit in Kevin McCarthy. The other aspect of the top in Mitch McConnell has an extraordinarily skilled politician. Whatever you think of Mitch McConnell, you'd be a fool not to understand that he is one of the most skilled politicians who's ever lived. And you have a party that is in favor of all sorts of things that have nothing to do with ideas. They have to do with make America white again.
Wow. Murphy's saying that just as we wrap up, Biden also offered help with Palestine cleanup, and the governor refused. Is that right? I didn't remember.
Yeah,
that.
Mike Lyons, the Republican governor of Ohio, doesn't want his star at all tarnished here.
No, that's right. Yeah.
And this is not the first time that's ever happened, and it isn't the last. It's sort of petty politics at the expense of people there. I do think that we should pay a lot of attention to how Norfolk Southern has behaved. Its CEO clearly is behaving badly. He only met with a small group of local people behind closed doors. His public comments have been so anodyne as to be soulless. And hopefully the board of directors of Norfolk Southern are going to wake up and remove him for his mishandling of this, because CEOs get paid. My wife was a CEO for 30 years. They get paid for strategy, vision, and execution. And I would say this guy has failed all three tests.
Well, you say it straight and you say it starkly, and I think it is a straight, stark situation. The way in which these deadly chemicals are transported and the way in which responsibility is shifted. So these companies get all the profits, all the benefits, all the tax benefits, which you've written about like crazy. And then the responsibility for cleanup and remediation falls to the communities and to the feds. It's revolting, really.
Yeah, that's a good word, revolting.
Well, all speaking of words, Tom, who is our unofficial keeper of ding words on the show, anodyne is a ding word. Very, very good.
Yep, agree with you, Tom.
Yes, thank you for hooking us up with the ding word on the way out. Catch David Cay Johnston here on Tuesdays and read all of his various work. It's a great piece he did back in January about something that we'll talk about next week. It's at dcreport.org, where he is a co-founder. David, so enjoy time with you. Thank you.
See you, folks.